Something that I say along the way will touch you. I know it. Let's begin that process of crafting a meaningful life.
Here's Mary Crafts.
Am I excited to have you with me today? We are here to craft our meaningful lives, and I'm Mary Crafts. I have the opportunity to be your host today, and I have a very special program for you today. As many of you know, I recently returned from Kenya, and I was there on a humanitarian mission for about 2 weeks. And yes, you would wonder, well, what could you possibly accomplish in 2 weeks? Well, not a lot if I hadn't gone with a group that had been there for 7 years already and had already been doing progress and had already been establishing programs. I went and worked for 2 weeks inside their structure. And I felt like I really gave my all. And there were many people there that were touched by my heart. But the flip side is I came home changed, not because of what I gave, but because of what I received. And the one thing I learned more than anything else that I just say over and over and over on this program, and you get it, and that is this concept, this principle, this universal vision of oneness, that we are way more alike than we are different, and that we have way more in common. What would I possibly have in common with a Maasai woman who has female genital mutilation and who was married at age 11 and had her first child at age 13, lives in a mud hut and has never worn underwear? None of those things apply to me. And yet, when I asked her why did she choose these things? She said, I want to belong. I want to be part of my tribe. I don't want to be by myself. I want a warrior to love me. I want to be accepted. Suddenly, like a light bulb in my head, I'm like, oh, duh. How many times have I heard those inner voices inside of me? How many times have I sat across this camera and had women weep here on this program who were doing the exact same thing? We are one, and I love it. But while I was in Africa, that's another podcast I'll talk about another time. I went with a team of 12, and one of them who serves with me on the Saprea advisory board, which is Saprea is an organization that stands and fights against childhood sexual abuse as well as its prevention. She said to me, Mary, of the 23 nonprofits that you are involved with, which one and what is the cause that you're most committed to? It didn't take me any time at all. And I said, Saprea. And she kind of, even though she's on the board with, she kind of furrowed her brow and said, really? I said, yep. Because when I first became involved with them, they were treating survivors. And they were helping people, women mainly, reclaim their lives after having experienced childhood sexual abuse. Now, their broader mission includes the prevention of, which is a little bit more difficult to tackle because we're talking about changing generations of programming in our actual cellular structure of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in our culture. I said, but I want you to think about all the causes that I deal with. I work with people who work with women at the prison, and I've asked them, how many of your women in the prison have experienced childhood sexual abuse? 100%. As you know, another one of my causes is anti-sex trafficking and rescuing and helping survivors and prevention of that. And when I speak with sexual trafficked women, the number one thing that they have in common, and you heard Lisa Jr. on this podcast twice And she said she began being groomed with sexual abuse at age 3. Every single woman who I've ever talked to, childhood sexual abuse began at early, unbelievable early ages. 100%. So if you look at people in the prison, if you look at people who are sex trafficked, if you look at women who are experiencing domestic violence, now they're not 100%, but the number is big. Why would this not be my number one cause and the way to look at sexual culture on our planet? So if you can feel how passionate I feel about this, to this end, I want to bring on my dear friend, Betsy Kanarowski. Betsy, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here, and I loved your introduction. All of that is so true.
Well, I was hoping, because you're the expert in this. You actually work for Saprea. You are the clinical psycho, the clinical psych.
I'm the chief clinical officer.
There you go.
Yeah.
I knew it was something really big sounding. Chief clinical officer who has doctorates and all sorts of things like that. I'm going to let you explain all of that. But, I think of the number, like I said, I've had 300 podcasts, and I bet you at least 100 of them have dealt with this issue. And I thought, okay, if this is such a big issue and I'm committed to working in this area, I better have somebody on here who actually knows what they're talking about, rather than just these summations that from my own observations that I've come along with. So welcome as my resident expert in this field.
Thank you.
So share with the listeners a little bit about your background and what your actual work entails at Saprea.
So I'm a clinical social worker. I've been practicing for, almost 30 years. I also have a PhD in special education, so I'm an educator as well.
Okay.
I feel passionately about educating people about abuse in general, working with women who are survivors, but also with individuals who may have disabilities, because the rates are so much higher for sexual abuse. Yeah, almost three times more likely to be abused if you have a disability. So that's how those two sort of work together. And I'm also a certified sex therapist.
Okay. Well, you have a lot under your belt.
Yeah.
Okay.
A lot of letters after my name.
I love all of that, because I need someone like that rather than just me spouting things I've learned in 70 years. So there you go. But okay, I want to go back to that one thing that I don't think about probably as much as I would like myself to think about it. And that is that the people with disabilities. So if we say 1 in 6, and the numbers vary, of course, from 1 in 4 to 1 in 7, but let's say 1 in 6 are experiencing childhood sexual abuse. What you're saying then is 1 in 2?
Yeah, so there's somewhere between
50%?
Well, it depends. These are hard numbers to get, because one of the things, especially with individuals who may have communication difficulties, they're unable to report often. What I can tell you is there's somewhere between, the research varies, it's somewhere between 3 and 7 times more likely to be a victim of child sexual abuse if someone has a disability. And lifetime sexual violence against women with disabilities is somewhere between 80 and 90% of women with disabilities in their lifetime will be a victim of some sort of sexual violence.
Wow,
those are horrible.
It's not
numbers.
unbelievable. It's not unbelievable, because I've read and studied so many things that I thought were unbelievable, but it is very, very sad. Mm-hmm. And this area that you work in, I guess one of the things that I want to ask you as a person, as a woman, you work every single day in this. Mm-hmm. How do you stay above water? How do you keep your nose above the waterline? and keep yourself from sinking? How do you do that?
I think there's a couple things. I practice good self-care. I make sure that everyone who works at Saprea practices good self-care. It's what do we need to do to keep ourselves safe and whole and functioning and know when we need to take a minute when things are hard. Practicing things like yoga, mindfulness, exercise, all the stuff that helps keep us really grounded. And so I do that. I think the other thing is, because people ask me a lot, how can you do this for so many years? And I kind of feel like, how could I not? This is really sacred work, being with people in their healing journeys. And it's important. And the vulnerability and trust that people open up to me and to be part of that, that's an honor. And so I look at it that way. It's not some job to be done or something that like, oh my gosh, this is so sad. It is sad. It is hard, but the human spirit is amazing. And being part of that, it's been a wonderful career. And I love that honor.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. First of all, that vision that you see it as an honor to be able to do this. And then you see the necessity of it. And then that you lift yourself and keep yourself on an even keel with self-care, self-love, self-awareness, all the things, and that you're supporting an entire company now. So you're surrounding yourself with like people. Mm-hmm. I think that's such a big thing. You can't expect yourself to be, Miss Wonderful and wrapped in a warm blanket if you work in a place where it's nothing but freezing cold.
Right.
Yeah. Wow. All right. So let's start with some of the problems.
Okay.
And how maybe you're addressing them at Saprea, and also what you see as more of a global approach to this as well, because I see what you're doing here in Utah. I know you have places in Georgia, in Europe. I think you're looking at a place in Kenya, which I just got back from, so I'm very excited about that. There's a global approach here. But when you look at the problem, how are you seeing this as a source? Like, for example, do you see childhood sexual abuse as a source of the ills of the world today? Or is it simply a symptom? Or is it all wrapped up?
I think it's both a source and a symptom. Because, and I'm not sure untangling that, it's not that I'm not sure, I know untangling that is very difficult.
Yeah.
When we look at it as a source, we know that child sexual abuse impacts people long past that event in childhood. You think of like the pebble going into water and the ripples. There's all these ripples from it. And it's very much a myth when people say, oh, you know what, that happened to you when you were 5. Can't you just forget about it or move on? That's not how trauma works. And so some of those ripples impact people's lives and then in turn their families' lives and communities way past the event. So things like mental health issues, depression, anxiety, eating disorders, unfortunately, suicide attempts, things like that are all related. But also trauma is stored in the body. And we know from the adverse childhood experiences study that there's a lot of medical outcomes that can be related to trauma as well, whether that's heart disease, inflammatory diseases, autoimmune. Yep. All of those can be related. So those are all very much symptoms. Trauma is experienced as emotional, behavioral, relational, and physical. So that kind of covers all of our areas. And so you think of those
I want to go back and list those again.
Okay.
So trauma is experienced as
emotional, physical, behavioral, and relational.
Wow.
So that's kind of everything.
Yeah. And, I have to say, I might add to that, as I see it as a key part of our beings, a spiritual,
Absolutely.
because I
Yes.
lived with someone who, because of his childhood trauma, his spiritual relationship was completely damaged, because how could a God allow this to happen to me? All those kinds of things, that he never wanted to draw close to that.
And I
Yeah.
think that no matter what your spiritual beliefs are, that spirituality gives you a place in the world and a way to relate to meaning and all that. And absolutely, trauma can be really negatively impact spirituality.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so the trauma issue, and that is what we're talking about here, the trauma that happens to a child. And I think you were really good at describing that it's not just to their body. It happens at a cellular level, and the brain chemistry that actually changes. Let's talk for a little bit about that kind of clinical piece that you're so brilliant at. And that is, what happens to the brain when the brain experiences sexual trauma at a young age.
Well, there's two parts to that. Unfortunately, in very early childhood, sexual trauma can actually change how the brain grows and impact the brain. So that's one area to look at, actual structural brain in early childhood. The other thing is, the brain and the nervous system are really complicated, and I am not a brain neuroscientist, so I'm going to break this down to super simple.
Okay.
But we have two parts of the brain, and the two parts of the brain involved with trauma. And so we have our limbic system, which deals with emotions and memories, and its job is to keep people safe. And so when trauma happens, our limbic brain is storing those memories. And what can happen then is, later on in life, and our limbic brain doesn't tell time. That's the interesting thing. We have like our frontal lobe up here, our prefrontal cortex, part of our cortex here. And the cortex is it's executive functioning. It's the part that's involved with rational thought and decision making and like that. We control that consciously. The limbic system, we're not controlling consciously. It's there to keep us safe. So the limbic system is the thing when, let's say, if a child is being abused, they may do what we call dissociation, where they just separate themselves from the situation altogether. They might find themselves floating up, feeling like they're floating up to the ceiling and looking down at it. They may just check out and completely go somewhere else. So that's the brain's way of keeping you safe. The deal with the limbic system is that it doesn't tell time. So what happens is, let's say I'm an adult who's a survivor of child sexual abuse and I experience a trigger, and my limbic brain matches that with the memory of the abuse, and it can feel like it's happening right this second. And so that's where I'm experiencing that as, emotionally, physically. I may then dissociate and completely check out because that's what I did before to keep myself safe. So that's the interesting thing with the brain, is I think we think of it as, oh, it's always this very rational problem solving kind of thing. But we have all these parts of our brain that are working automatically beyond our control. We don't decide when trauma happens. We don't say, should I do fight, flight, or freeze? That's made in a second. It scans, that limbic part of our brain scans the environment, figures it out, does what's going to keep us safe, and boom. Does that kind of answer that?
It does. It does a lot, and on the people who are my listeners, this is not going to be completely unfamiliar to them, because I talk about it in different, but the terms perhaps, but the idea is the same. But I talk about this thinking, this cerebral part of the brain that didn't begin to develop until maybe I was 7 or 8. And some people didn't finish that frontal lobe until they were 30, but hopefully it happened earlier than that. But that is that thinking part where you get to choose. But this back part, that fight or flight that I call it, that, automatic response that I should run or I should put my fists up, that is sometimes out of our control.
Yeah.
So is it possible for this part to get control of that part and to be able to make logical, rational decisions about whether you should fight or flight, or is it forever and always just an automatic response?
So there are some things you can do between when we have our trigger and then we have an immediate response, right? Which is that immediate response could be fight, flight, freeze, those kind of things. There are ways, working with mindfulness, with therapy, processing the trauma, things like that, that you can start to grow a space between that stimulus and the response. And in that space is where you start to be able to have this ability to say, okay, I'm safe right now. What am I going to, I have some choice of things I can do. And as people are working through that, it may start out as a little tiny space and then it grows bigger and bigger. So are we always kind of at the mercy of this limbic system? Yes, it's going to react, but we can start to grow some of that space between our responses to ground ourselves, to say it's not the past. I'm safe. This person just reminds me of the person who hurt me. This isn't that person. Things like that. To say, oh, I'm starting to feel like I'm not in my body anymore. How do I need to get back to it? And that's where that power lives, is in that space as it gets bigger and bigger.
Yeah. That is such a key piece from my own personal experience. I had a 28-year marriage that was a very physically, emotionally, verbally abusive. Mm-hmm. And now that I'm in a different relationship with John, we had to go through about almost 2 years. The first year for sure, of like my response immediately to him was triggered when he'd say something. I would just get either my fists up or I would just go into hiding. Mm-hmm. And he had to take me by the shoulders and say, look at me. Mm-hmm. This is John. It's not who I am or what I'm about. That was triggering to you. Do you understand? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, I do. Okay. Can we begin to choose something different? I'm going to work on not triggering you. But on your end, you also have to work on realizing that I am John. And it took us a while to get past that. And I would say now we're 3 years into this relationship. We're still not 100% past it, but we're probably 95, 96%.
Nice.
But I'm always have to be mindful and aware. So is that a skill set that you're teaching at some of your retreats for the childhood survivors?
Absolutely. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's I asked the question. Yeah.
Absolutely. That we provide very specific things that you can do, right? Because people want, especially adults, we want to know, okay, I have something that's really hard for me. What are things that I can do to address this? Mm-hmm. And mindfulness is absolutely at the key, at the core, of healing from trauma. Mindfulness is being present in the here and now. It's recognizing that, like you said, he's saying you're safe. And so it's recognizing that I'm okay right now, and this is not the past replaying itself.
Yeah. That is a key. So not just for childhood sexual survivors, but basically for all of us. Because here's the big bad secret is that we've all had some sort of childhood trauma. Mm-hmm. That whether it be sexual or emotional or something, we all came away with some damage that says, I'm not enough. I'm not okay. Mm-hmm. This is not a safe place to be. And we all need to learn that skill.
And the human brain really struggles with mindfulness. It defaults a little bit to, a lot of us spend a whole bunch of time in a past that we can't change, or a future that we don't know what's going to happen, that's uncertain.
Right.
And so getting back to the here and there, it's challenging. And evolutionary wise, obviously that made sense for people's brains to work that way because it keeps you safe to learn from the past, to be scanning for things in the future. But most of us, we bounce between both of those a lot. And being present in the here and now is a challenge.
Do you deal with in your clinical programs at Saprea any of the piece that talks about this trauma being held at a cellular level? You mentioned something about, in wellness or illness that, so I hear so much about that now, and I'm kind of delving into that piece of if it's held at a cellular level throughout our bodies, then how do we begin to release trauma at a cellular level?
So I am not, full disclosure, an expert in this area. However, in my experience with working with trauma, there's very much that somatic release. We hold trauma in our bodies. And I mean, one thing that Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score, talks about this a lot is shake it out. If you get in a car accident, shake like an animal does, that if you see out on the savannah, it freezes and hopefully survives an attack and falls over. And then it stands up and it shakes out to let it out of our bodies, out of its body. But as humans, we don't always do that. And so that trauma stays very trapped inside of us. And so that's why things like, the somatic therapies where you're doing release with your body, trauma-informed yoga, Tai Chi, walking, all of these things. I mean, it's good for our bodies to connect with our bodies because number one, many people with sexual trauma kind of disconnect from their body altogether, just not really feeling it because that makes sense given what happened. But as we reconnect with our bodies and then find ways to let out some of that trauma, it really helps because it's not just all up here. It is held throughout you. And people, when they're processing trauma in a therapeutic setting, let's say I'm doing therapy with somebody, we're often identifying where things are in their body. People saying, I can feel it right here. I can barely, the lump in my throat is so tight, or I feel it in my stomach, or I have pain in my hands. And so that's that trauma being stored in the body, and we can't just ignore that. It's just as important as the brain because it's all connected. It's all the same nervous system.
Yeah, I love that. I probably 6 months ago just started this morning meditation practice that I kind of just came up with on my own.
Nice.
Which seemed to work for me because I wasn't doing guided meditation. I wasn't doing following a program on my phone about how to move. And I just realized one day, my body wants to move. Mm-hmm. And I want to listen to it. So when I was in Africa, every morning I would get up and go outside and just do this movement. And one day someone saw me and said, "Oh, is that Tai Chi?" I said, "Oh, I'd like to think that it is, but I really don't know what that is." I am just allowing listen. It is a matter of learning to listen. Like, oh, my neck wants to move. Oh. And just listening and responding to that. And that's something that I think as humans, but particularly as Americans, or anyone in a first world country, have become disassociated with their bodies to the point where that it's either coming from here, this lovely handheld device, or it's coming from their computer, sometimes from other people, which is still a plus, but rarely from here, from self, from listening to self, what self needs, what self wants. Yeah. Is it?
I think a lot, and we say this a lot at our work at Saprea, is what does your body need? How does it feel like it should move? And so I think what you are doing is absolutely beautiful. And I agree that everyone should be doing that. And I hope you're yelling that from the rooftops because it is incredibly important to say, what does my body want and need? We are a whole body. And I do think we're so far away from the power of movement. It's so important.
Yeah. And someone later asked me on the trip, they began to join me in the morning. And someone asked me, well, where do I find out more about this, about how to move? And I said, you just ask yourself. That's it. You do what your body wants you to do. The first day that I was outside in my, what I call my sacred garden, and I was doing this practice, I was aware that my hands were saying, I want to touch the ground. I don't ever get to touch the ground. It's almost like my hands were saying, don't protect me from the earth. Mm-hmm. And I just knelt right down and put my hands on the ground. And that has become such a significant thing for me every day now, just to listen to myself. Okay, Betsy, were you at the SAFE symposium that Saprea recently gave?
Unfortunately, I was not. I was working at our retreat.
Well, you were doing great things. So explain to people about the retreats, and then I'm going to come back to this symposium. What you do at the retreats with Saprea.
So we have 2 retreats. We have one in Utah and one in Georgia, and they are free, and they are for adult female survivors of child sexual abuse who were abused at age 18 and younger, and they can come attend the retreat at age 18 and older. And like I said, it's free. People have to get to us, so they're responsible for either driving to us or flying. We pick them up at the airport. But then it is a 4-day retreat where they're there with, depends on the location, either 8 other women or 16 other women. And it's 4 days of education, of experience, connecting with your body, and most importantly, connecting with other survivors, of building community, because abuse takes place in isolation and healing takes place within a supportive, compassionate community.
Yeah. So let's talk about these retreats. I've obviously attended every single Saprea gala that you've ever had.
Thank you.
And obviously support it with my time, my energy, financially, because I so believe in this mission. But one of the things I hear when you actually start talking about what the retreats are and what they compose of, it all sounds wonderful to people until the moment you say they're 4 days. Mm-hmm. And of course, the question then that always comes, I'm ready for it now. I have an answer. What can you possibly change from years of this trauma in 4 days? So how do you respond to that?
Well, I have to say, when I very first started at Saprea 8.5 years ago, and we did our first retreat that we had designed, I was thinking, wow, I hope we can do something in 4 days. And you know what? We can. It is amazing what 4 days does. And these are busy 4 days. People don't have to attend everything. I mean, we very much prioritize self-care, take a break when you need to, but we are doing things from like 7 a.m. till 9, 10 o'clock at night with breaks in there. Right. And I think we make this sort of educational framework for people to learn things and learn very specific tools and understand trauma in the brain and understand that their reactions have been a very normal reaction to a horrible, abnormal thing that happened to them. But that 4 days, how community is built, is truly amazing. Women come in on Monday and, they're coming to a place they've never been before with people they don't know to talk about something they don't particularly want to talk about. So people are kind of, with reason, a little on edge, saying, "Ooh, I'm not sure about this." On Thursday, everyone's hugging, and we can barely get them to be quiet enough to do our final wrap-up session because everybody's so talking and bonded. And so I think it's within that 4 days, that community and the education and the experience all wraps up into something that creates lasting change. Do we fix? I mean, you never fix trauma, but are we, you don't come into a 4-day psychoeducational retreat and say, okay, now I'm good. I'm, trauma, great, check that box off.
Sure.
It doesn't work that way. However, that 4 days gives such a foundation for people to understand they're not alone, which is the most important healing thing, I think, to know. Other people get this. I'm okay. And so, I don't know, I could go on for days about what we can do in 4 days, but it really is, until you've seen it, it's kind of hard to believe that much change could happen. But then those 4 days, people leave and they stay in touch with each other. People say, you know what, I talked about this for the first time. I'm going to think about doing therapy, or I'm going to start reaching out to my friends and talking about this, or I'm going to go to a support group. We do research at Saprea. We do research from right before someone comes up to a year later. We have 6 different times that we send them surveys. And a year after attending the retreat, on average, people are reporting a 45% increase in life satisfaction and a 37% decrease in post-traumatic stress symptoms. So,
Wow.
4 days does do something.
Absolutely. Can you imagine having 40% less stress in your life?
Right.
Or things that trigger you into that trauma state?
Mm-hmm.
That is life-changing. And
Yeah.
I'm sure then really motivates them to continue the path of healing and self-love and self-care and reducing that fight or flight response from trauma.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that
I love the
self-compassion.
work. Yeah, self-compassion. Absolutely. I love that. I mentioned about the symposium that Saprea put on, and there was a speaker there, the first speaker in the morning. I think his name was John Miller. I may not have that right, but that's right. Okay,
Yes.
good. I was so enthralled and motivated by that talk. Had I heard about this situation on the news? Yep. Had I seen some of the news clips? Yep. Had I understood it from a human standpoint and the trauma involved? No, that's not reported on the news. But when he talked about his wife and having experienced this childhood sexual trauma in her early teens and how that went on and then how it resurfaced after they were married, and then the behaviors, the acting out, the resurgence of this trauma, how it affected their family, and then how later she actually developed, even after she came forward and spoke about it. Well, because initially no one believed her,
Right.
which is the worst trauma.
Yes.
But then, of course, she was trying so much to heal, and yet she developed MS, which we all know is a stress-induced disease in our bodies, and then passed away. I think she was like 54. So, like me, who's 70, that's like young. That's like really young.
Yeah, she
And
was young.
after her death, the family to find peace, to clear her name, because she still was not acknowledged as a victim. The police who had done this to her never owned up to it. Highway patrol, and there was seemed to be a whole bunch of people involved in the Sikh community. And what you could see there was that here was someone who'd been traumatized, was able to gather enough fortitude inside to appear having put it behind her, which is what everyone wants us to do. Just put that behind you. It's gone. It's over. You don't have to live that every day. You can get better. Just go on. And then it resurfaces.
It does.
nearly destroys her family, and eventually does destroy her. When I hear stories like that, I think about the work that you're doing. I think about how I just am so grateful for you. You personally, and for Saprea, and anyone who stands up and is willing to give safe place for these people to tell their story. And I wear a t-shirt now that just says, "Believe survivors."
Yes.
Yeah. Mine had to do with domestic violence, but no matter what, believe survivors.
Yes.
As we close today, Betsy, I just could talk to you for another hour. Maybe we'll have you back another day because I have lots more questions to ask, but I'm past my time. So as we close today, what is your message to the people who listen to this podcast, mainly women between the ages of 30 and 55, mainly career women, mainly in the Intermountain West, even though I have people in Dubai and Switzerland and Philippines, and I never know how the heck they find me. But if you could leave something with them, what would be your final note, your final message to leave with people on the work that you're doing and your hope for them?
I have a lot of final messages. The one I would start with is what you said, which is, we believe you. If you are a survivor of child sexual abuse, we believe you. And I know that shame and society and families, and there can be all sorts of different things telling you otherwise, but I just want you to know you're worth it. You're worth exploring what your healing journey looks like. And, you know, if you're a survivor, please come take a look at our resources. Come to our website at saprea.org. We have a lot of information. And
Yes.
if you are a supporter of someone, and I hope we are all supporters of survivors of child sexual abuse, I think it's important as a society as a whole to educate ourselves. Let's start talking about this. Let's not sweep it under the rug. Let's not assume that it happens somewhere else. It happens in every community. And so let's have an open, honest dialogue. Let's support people who are hurting, and let's change the world, huh?
I'm with
I'm
you.
with you.
I honestly believe I'm going to live another 30, 35 years.
Nice.
You know, at least till 100, 105. And I'm going to see some major changes in this world. And
hope so.
I want to be part of it. I am part of it.
You are. Yes. Thank you.
You know, Betsy, in my book, my listeners are so familiar with this, but I refer back to it almost every episode. And the reason is because something a guest is saying is right on my favorite part of the book. And when I say this, you're going to understand. In the part of the book that I talk about, the healing can start only when the hiding stops. Things that happened to us happened in the dark, either in a closet or in the middle of the night or hidden from society. Maybe it was simply that your mother shamed you your whole life. She didn't do that out in the middle of the street. More than likely, it was inside closed doors and behind closed windows. And we cannot begin to heal any of it until we are willing to stop hiding. And I love that piece. And that you talked about that today I'm like, oh, same. So thank you. Thank you for being here and sharing your wealth. And you can bet, Betsy, I hope you're comfortable with podcasts because you're coming back.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate you having me, and I appreciate all you do to support Saprea and to champion our cause and make a difference in the world in so many different ways. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Betsy. And to all of you, Let's be about crafting our meaningful life, and this is how we do it. Namaste.
Crafting a meaningful life.